Has Russian propaganda messaging changed since the announcement of mobilization? You keep asking the questions, I keep answering them. Still in, if you forgive me, quick fire form, because lots of questions are coming in. And at the moment, I think the best way to do is to race through them. And I promise, we will have beautiful, long, gentle Q&As where I honor each individual's question. Has Russian propaganda changed since the announcement of mobilization? Yeah, in two ways. I'm seeing quite a widespread influencer campaign where the same script has been lowered all the way across the social media platforms. And the script basically goes like this. You see, this is my makeup set, and I've got different things in it. And if you think about mobilization, which is, by the way, the topic of my post today, even though I normally write about makeup, it's only going to be this tiny bit of my makeup set that's affected. So can we please not freak out? And anyway, freaking out makes the enemy gain confidence. And people are doing this with the McDonald's replacement. Have a look at this. It's called Tasty Period. Have a look at this chip. How freaked out would you be if just one chip was taken out of your, whatever it is, packet of chips? It's not that big a deal, and come on, that's basically the proportion that's being mobilized. And you're getting these pictures of, I don't know, orange chocolate slice boxes with just one being picked out, and the message is, look, this is just one among 30 orange chocolate slices. Would you freak out if one got taken away from you? So there's a real influencer campaign that's all in accordance with a single script, and it's often young influencers sharing this stuff. The second thing, much more significantly, that I'm seeing is that the narrative of the war against the West is being centered, and the story about Ukraine and denazification and demilitarization, quote unquote, is being made secondary. And the lovely Ukrainian philosopher and public intellectual Andrei Baumeister said in a recent note that what the Kremlin's done, discourse-wise, since mobilization, is got out Sam Huntington's book Clash of Civilizations and put it on steroids. And I think the consequence of that in the medium term is going to be that Russia's conversation with itself through the propaganda machinery is going to get even more disturbing and incoherent, because what this does is it really places the Dugin story about what's happening more centrally. And that's a story that once you talk about it for more than 5 minutes ceases to make sense, even to a Russian audience that watches state TV. So we're going to have this narrative about an existential war with the West gain priority. We're already seeing it. But that means that this story about how Russia is resisting Western civilization is going to have to be filled out more. And it's going to be filled out with sort of unbelievable idiocy and laughably incoherent propositions. How does the Kremlin feel about all of the people leaving the country? Close to 50-50. I would probably say it doesn't love it to a degree of 60%, but it loves it to a degree of 40%. I mean, it's happy to get rid of these people, but it also doesn't want to lose the economic benefit of them staying. It doesn't want to lose the workforce. It doesn't lose the capacity. Want to lose the capacity to mobilize them. But I think another part of this is that it's probably been arranged that a lot of people who are children, relatives of people in positions of power might want to relocate, either to not get mobilized, and more realistically to not have questions asked about them about why they're not being mobilized. So lots of people are probably removing their kids and relatives who hold sort of moderate positions of power in Russia. I think that's also a small part of this story. Will they close the borders? It's logical that they should close not just the borders, but that they should close regional borders. And the expectation here should be that they'll either do that formally or informally. They could find a way to close external and internal regional borders to men of a certain age. What's in the minds of the people that are on these buses that are being sent to the front? They're releasing pictures with rusty gear and videos of themselves walking on foot. It's an extraordinary crisis of moral consciousness and false consciousness. I mean, above all, what is cruelest on these people is that they're being put themselves in a position in which much of quote-unquote the civilized world thinks that the best outcome is for them to be killed in as vast numbers as possible, as quickly as possible. So there's something extraordinarily cruel about your fate if you've ended up in a predicament where people who send money every month to Human Rights Watch take the view that the quicker your life is taken, the better. So that's an extraordinary kind of predicament they've put themselves in. They are not aware of the real picture about the war in the vast majority of cases. And they probably feel that Ukraine is more important to Russia than it is to the West, but they are not cognizant of the fact that Ukraine is more important to Ukraine than it is to Russia, and that they're going to have to deal with that. They're fearful, helpless, and they are spectacularly, in many cases, not even conscious of the rights that they should have in this situation, which they obviously don't. Is Russia becoming more fascist since mobilization? It's terribly hard to talk about that term out of context without giving it 3 or 4 definitions and then choosing one to go with. I hate people who are loose with this word, fascism, but I also reject people who say that you should only use it in a particular limited sense, because it's too late for that. There's a kind of everyday political use of that term, and the best thing to do is to correct that usage rather than to try to retire it. But I would say that insofar as you're talking about the component of the population and the state coming together, then no, Russia is not becoming more fascist. But in the sense of the state just endlessly interfering in your private life to the point of taking possession of your body, then yes. But in that sense of the people and the regime becoming one, no. How do Putin's inner circle feel about the mobilization? Okay, reluctantly accepting, in the sense of Putin's very, very narrow circle, and that's Putin's own position too. He reluctantly accepts this necessity. But if you look at the hundreds and thousands of people who might be in and around the regime, so let's say the 1,000 people in the country with the most power, fantasies in their heads about Putin evaporating are going to increase dramatically as a result of this decision. There is no doubt about that. Why haven't they closed the borders? We've done. When will blowback come after mobilization? The protests now are protests against mobilization, and they're on a small scale. For there to be larger protests and protests against the regime, you want to basically wait till a picture emerges where it's clear to the Russian population that the mobilization has been done and that it was cruel and bloody, but then unproductive. So you might think about, by, let us say, springtime, it becoming apparent to Russians that the mobilization hasn't fundamentally changed the course of the war. And then I think we're going to be in a position of greater uncertainty about how that bond, a breakage of that limited bond between the government, the regime, and the people is going to play out. What is victory for Putin? Taking Kiev. All that the current situation is amounting to for Putin is that taking Kiev is going to be a slower process, and worst case scenario will require his successor to execute on that. But short of taking Kiev, he wants to get to a negotiating position where Ukraine will say that at least for the foreseeable future, we accept letting go these particular parts of our territory. And that's a goal that's not very easy for Putin to achieve. Who is most impacted by mobilization? Ethnically and socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. And there's a kind of a brutality there, not just because in some of these regions you've already had a real concentration of the state coming in and taking people to the front even without conscription, but also because they're being taken to fight for a kind of Russian world vision. So there isn't even a kind of a fake Soviet cosmopolitanism. I mean, you're being asked to fight for a vision, a deranged vision of an ethnic group that's not yours. You said Russians are naive about how serious mobilization is. Will this change? So I've said that Russians are still not awake to how important it is for them to stay the hell away from this thing trying to scoop people up to the front, and how excuses and sort of legitimate legal grounds to not be conscripted might play no role. You can just be taken, whatever your circumstances. How are they going about processing this? I think it'll take time. They are very depoliticized and very out of the loop, and politics is going to hit them in the face, hitting them in the face. I would say that still this sort of really shocking passivity is playing a part. In other words, people are saying, I hope it passes me by. There's a Russian word called pronесет, which means I hope it just sort of I managed to sort of maneuver my way out of the current of events that picking up, taking people to the front. So that's still, I'm gonna get away with it. That's the psychology still. It's not the state is coming and doing something grossly inappropriate. We should all reject. If Putin dies, will the war stop? If you want a one-word answer, then yes, it will stop if he dies. It's not as clear as that, but it's much more yes than no. If you had to persuade Russians to protest in big numbers, what argument would you make? Well, I'd first tell them not to. So if somebody said, look, I'm in Moscow and I've got 20,000 people who are fully determined to march through the city until they're physically stopped, I would say don't do it. Because you obviously don't want to protest against this regime by walking through an open door. You need the protest to achieve some kind of effect of meeting resistance and beating it. But at the moment, it's going to basically take these people out of action for the future moment when protest will be genuinely effective. And given the unpredictability of this situation, you never know when that'll happen. And that's why Russian opposition figures, who are mostly in the West, are not calling on Russians to protest at the moment, even though that's the bread and butter of what Russian opposition do, to the point that that's almost a criticism of them, that they focus too much on protest from about 2011 onwards, and not enough on trying to penetrate institutions by recent years, it was already too late to penetrate institutions. But the reason they're calling people on the street is because you want to preserve that potential for when there is a push. I mean, you don't want to come out unless you've got a kind of 20% chance of significantly rearranging the chessboard in some way. So at the moment, if you come out, you might be picked up and just taken to the front, or you might lose your job and end up in a much more insecure predicament half a year from now and not feel comfortable to protest then, or you might just go to prison. So you want to sort of hold back on that until there is a real perspective, a plausible perspective of transformation available. But well, look, if I had to persuade them to protest, I'd say this. If I had to persuade them to protest now, think about how much you oppose the regime. Think about where you live. If you live in a very big urban center, the odds are a lot of people who are your neighbors also don't like the regime, and you've got a kind of bias, cognitive bias going on, almost certainly, which is that you overestimate the degree to which people around you support the regime. And that's a kind of a self-perpetuating bias, because the regime spends a lot of money and energy in cultivating that bias. So in Moscow, for example, you will often find a building where half of the people think Putin is a calamity, but they don't take cognizance of the fact that that's really the case in their building. So when they walk around in the elevator, going down the stairs, they're not taking cognizance of the fact that half the people they're meeting don't like Putin. They kind of think, well, no, surely everybody kind of tends to side with the regime, so maybe it's an 80-20 breakdown in my building. But in fact, in big urban centers, it's going to be more likely than not that there's a bigger sympathy for your position than you assume. Why is Putin on holiday? He's in his Valdai mansion. I don't know. I think that obviously, according to Navalny's team, he's got every kind of health and self-care procedure available to him there that has been humanly invented, from salt pools to cryotherapy to God knows what. But I think that short of self-care and getting some medical appointments in, he is trying possibly to write the narrative around these referenda and frame that story for Russians as some kind of a glorious conquest, and framing how far to mobilize the population politically, and framing how far to go with the mobilization, how to deal with the blowback from it, framing how to make nuclear threats. So taking stock, and probably in a way where less stuff is coming at him than in the Kremlin, and with consultation with his more informal circle, his more informal Politburo than what he might be doing in the Kremlin. So that's what I think he's potentially up to there. What is Kadyrov's end game? Well, Kadyrov is just keen to protect his region, and he is keen to not have too many people sent to the front from his region, and he has got a quarter of an eye out on some kind of a civil war catastrophe, in which case he would want Chechnya to be in a good place. We're going to talk much more properly soon. Thank you for tuning in.